Locked and loaded or ready to negotiate? US President Donald Trump says he's still considering intervention in Iran to protect anti-government protesters. But will that be in the form of bombs or a big, beautiful deal? Either way, many regional analysts say it's the beginning of the end of the Islamic Republic. Are they right? It's up for debate on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nusafora. They're the largest anti-establishment protests in Iran in years, and they're also the most deadly. Verifiable information out of the country is hard to come by because leaders cut phone and internet access for days. But a lot of regional analysis points to one outcome.
If a regime can only maintain its power through violence, then it is effectively finished. I assume that we are now seeing the last days and weeks of this regime.
But that's far from a certainty. Authorities have, for now, managed to contain the demonstrations. And a weekend visit from Oman's foreign minister, a one-time mediator in this crisis, has raised speculation that there's the potential for a deal with the US.
What you're hearing publicly from the Iranian regime is quite differently from the messages the administration is receiving privately. And I think the president has an interest in exploring those messages. However, with that said, the president has shown he's unafraid to use military options if and when he deems necessary. And nobody knows that better than Iran.
So coming up, we'll ask our panel, is this the beginning of the end for Iran's leadership? Will the US intervene, and what would that look like? And what regional fallout is on the horizon? Joining us for this discussion is Arash Azizi, lecturer at Yale University and author of What Iranians Want: Women, Life, Freedom. Jake Wallace-Simmons is back with us, a Daily Telegraph columnist and presenter of The Brink podcast. And rounding out our panel is Glenn Deason, professor at University of Southeastern Norway, who also hosts his own show on YouTube. Gentlemen, welcome to Counterpoints. Thanks for being with us. Well, these protests that we've seen began with traders closing their shops in protest against deteriorating economic conditions and the collapse of the Iranian currency. But as they continued, they have morphed into something so much bigger, with chants of death of the dictator ringing out across the country. Authorities say the situation is now contained and under control and accuse foreign actors of destabilising the country. But that doesn't mean the underlying anger that has been seen has disappeared. Arash, let's start with you. Is this the beginning of the end of Iran's leaders? Or is the current governing system going to survive these protests the way they have others?
I have to be honest that the first time I wrote an article called Beginning of the End of the Islamic Republic was in 2009 when I wrote it for my student press, and it's been sometimes there. But I really do believe that, that the regime is on its last legs. And that's because you know, I'm a little older and wiser now, so it's not just sort of a revolutionary sentiment. I believe the core structures and the core policies of the regime are simply untenable. Now it faces tremendous pressure from below. It's basically hard for it to govern. This is no way of governing. If you realize the regime has faced how many waves of mass protests just since 2017, this is like a fourth wave of mass nationwide protest, often of insurrectionary character. So internally it cannot govern, and externally it faces very credible threats from Israel and the United States, as so in the June war, 12-day war, and now President Trump threatening it again. So the particular form that its downfall will take it still remains to be seen. But for me, there's no doubt that Iranian revolutionaries have a chance to win, but more importantly, that the core structures and core policies of the Islamic Republic are untenable and won't live long in this world.
Glenn, some regional analysts have written and have commentated that the Iranian government is at its weakest point in nearly half a century. Is it? And do you think it can survive this latest shockwave?
I think usually a lot of the media reports exaggerate to a large extent. There is an effort, of course, to mobilize support for trying to regime change Iran and also build up support for war. There's, of course, some popular uprising and protests against the government in Iran, but I think it's also been fueled very heavily by foreign elements. So, mostly Western intelligence agencies as well as Mossad. But no, I don't think the government is especially weak at this point. We've seen also the counter rallies being run as well, in which hundreds of thousands come out in support of the government. So I think the effort to make the government look weaker than it is, I think this is deceptive to a large extent.
Jake, what do you make of that assessment?
Well, I'm afraid Glenn is just parroting regime propaganda. It's just nonsense. The regime enjoys no more than about 15% of support amongst Iranians. At least 85% are against the regime. There is no evidence whatsoever that the CIA or Mossad or anybody else is fomenting opposition to the regime. And any crowds that have come out in support of the regime largely are paid for by the regime itself. It's very clear that the Iranians don't need any encouragement from any outside source to oppose this brutal, dictatorial and fanatical regime that has wasted $500 billion on a failed nuclear program that pumps tens of billions into foreign proxies, militia, including Hezbollah, including Hamas, including the Houthis and others, but neglects its own people. Iran could be a G20 country. It could be a successful, liberal, Western-friendly democracy with an ancient, educated and sophisticated people that deserves better than this horrendous, fanatical and cultish regime. Long live the revolution. I do hope that the revolution succeeds in overturning the Ayatollah and his henchmen. However, I'm afraid I don't share Arash's optimism at this point, because I worry that the one thing that the regime has going for it is a monopoly on violence. The IRGC has systematic control over the people, not just in its 11 national headquarters that oversee the 31 provinces of Iran, but then 3 or 4 layers below that going down into local neighborhoods. They're the only ones really who are armed in any significant way. And they have the power, we've seen it in the past, to ramp up the violence until they win. The playbook is the same. They black out the internet, they kill the mobile phone signals, and they massacre people until they win. That's happening again as we speak to these brave Iranians who are taking their lives into their hands in the streets. And the only person who could stop the revolution from being repressed in this brutal way is one Donald Trump.
Arash, I'm going to come to you for a response in a moment, but Glenn, I just want to give you a right of reply to Jake's comments there. Is this just a repeat of Iranian propaganda, to use Jake's words?
No, I think it's, it doesn't make any sense. The United States, Iran, and Israel has just gone to war against Iran. Multiple Western governments have been trying to regime change the country for ages. The United States planning yet another war with them. So the whole premise here that these Western governments and their intelligence agencies, that their main strategy is just the well-being of Iranians, hoping that they will have democracy and freedom. It's rather absurd. We've seen this.
Glenn, what evidence do you have that Mossad and the CIA are involved in this? What evidence do you have?
Since the Arab Revolution and beyond. How many governments do we have to see in the region being toppled? First destabilized with economic pressure, political pressure, then trying to hijack any popular uprisings or protests in order to instigate some kind of regime change. If it doesn't work, we always see the same thing. That is this claim that, we're going to now go and help or support the locals so they can get their freedom. And at the end of the day, we bomb, destroy their countries, and then no one gains, especially not the people of the country, but in the wider world as well. We only have instability. We see the same script every single time. And I think it's been, rather exhausted. And we've even seen people like Mike Pompeo, who's a former director of the CIA, who sent out this tweet wishing all Iranians Happy New Year's on the street and all their Mossad agents walking next to them. I mean, it's very strange to argue that this is Iranian propaganda to suggest Western intelligence agencies are operating in Iran.
So let me look. Western intelligence agency, I'm sure, are operating in Iran. But first of all, let me tell you this: I'm an Iranian socialist, and all my life I've fought not just against the Iranian regime, but I oppose imperialism, whether it comes from America or Russia or anywhere else. And I've never been a fan of even sanctions imposed on Iran, for example. I'm not a fan, particularly of sort of Israel's regional actions and all that. But opposing it's quite silly. You would have to believe that Iranian students, Iranian workers, Iranian young men and women who have their daily oppressed by this regime, who now have seen the destruction of their economy, have seen the total destruction of our country, would need some sort of a foreign motivation to revolt against it. So it's fine to do propaganda for anybody, but I hope you're not actually silly enough to believe it yourself. If you actually, teach in university, if you really think about it, and you think that, for example, an Iranian nurse who now with her monthly salary is not able to afford a apartment, 100% of her salary is not able to afford an apartment in Tehran, would need CIA or Mossad to tell her to go out to protest. Or that thousands of Iranians who have been killed. Why do you think so many Iranians come out despite the threat of being killed in 2017, in 2019, in 2022, in 2023, and now 2025, 2026? Which foreign agency can help pay people enough to go out and to get killed? So this is quite silly. Of course, all Iran's agencies try to operate also in the West all the time, and they use propaganda in the West. They have channels. Everybody has channels of mass communication and try to bank on each other's sort of popular movements and all that. But there's a reason they're not toppling governments in the Western world. The way the Iranians who access information from free channels, learn about their own government and come out against it. Now, as for to Jake, the question of optimism, I want to be clear. I have no illusions that we are near victory or that this is very easy. I agree that the important, for me, there are two missing elements. One is a unified leadership coalition that really can claim to represent majority of Iranians, and we don't have that, unfortunately. That's on us. We haven't been able to build that yet, partially due to the regime's repression, because some of our best candidates are in prison, partially because abroad we haven't been able to get our act together. The second element linked to that is the securing the defection of security forces, but which you need the leadership in order to bring about the defection, and that's how you win a revolution. But the reason of my broader optimism and the reason I'm ready to write the obituary of the Islamic Republic is that even if you're not able to advance the revolution forward at this stage, the untenability of regime's core policies and structures are too much to bear. And in fact, I believe if you asked me, if you had this interview like in November, I would say that internal elements in the regime, in fact, will bring about some of these changes, cut a deal with the United States indirectly with Israel, try to bring a deal that also placates the Iranian people in some way. Won't be the best case scenario. I'm going to fight for democratic transition all my life. I'm going to fight for democracy all my life. But even short of a democratic transition, Ayatollah Khamenei, who will die at some point, he's turning 87 by April, it's very likely to be the last leader of the Islamic Republic as we know it. The core policies, and let me just very quickly say, what are the core policies? So the domestic sort of Islamist repression, but also the anti-American, anti-Israeli policy that has really brought our country under all these sanctions and confrontation are going to be replaced. We're going to replace those, instead of death to America or death to Israel, with long live Iran. And I think that is where our country is headed, regardless of whether we've been in the revolution or not.
You've all been bringing up this idea of outside interference, perhaps, in these protests. Before I ask my next question, I just want you to have a listen to Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. This is what he said just a couple of days ago.
We have a large amount of documents and evidence indicating the involvement of both the United States and Israel in this terrorist act. We don't seek war, but we are fully prepared for it, even more prepared than before the previous war.
Jake, And I also referenced the social media post on X that Glenn brought up from Mike Pompeo saying, every Mossad agent walking beside them. Is Israel operating inside Iran to inflame these protests for their own benefit? Is this less organic and more outside orchestrated?
I mean, that's just an absurd proposition, which Arash rightly ridiculed and totally put to bed. I'm not sure why we don't just move on from that ridiculous idea. Glenn should hang his head in shame for spreading the regime propaganda in that way. Mossad could not be responsible for an uprising involving hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. The Iranian people again and again have taken to the streets, as Arash said, every few years, sacrificing their lives to try to overturn this tyrannical regime which oppresses them like the Stasi. It's the #1 execution capital of the world per capita, the most executions per capita in the entire world. It has been blinding protesters, intentionally blinding young protesters as a deterrent against coming out against the regime. It's fanatical, it's millenarian, and it seeks an apocalyptic war based on some absurd theology. Now, they don't need any encouragement, as Arash rightly points out, from the Mossad or CIA or anybody else to come out and try to oppose this regime. I would oppose this regime if I was on the streets of Iran. I dare say Glenn would oppose the regime if he had his head screwed on properly, if he was living under that kind of regime. He wouldn't want his kids going out and being blinded by the regime. He wouldn't want to have to go to a morgue to go through body bags to find the bodies of his own children who'd been protesting for freedom and democracy in their country. It's absurd to suggest that this is some kind of foreign Zionist American plot. This is regime propaganda through and through, and we really shouldn't be giving it the time of day in a grown-up, sensible debate of this sort. Now, I mean, just to turn briefly to more sensible topics, Arash talked about his overall optimism that the regime will fall in the end. I think he's absolutely right, and I hope and pray that that happens sooner rather than later. My worry is that it has that monopoly on violence and is willing to use it, as we've seen, ramping up the violence in a brutal and unacceptable, appalling way until it wins. And I think defections, Arash brought up that point, is vital as well. We do need to see security forces of whatever sort beginning to defect to the side of the protesters in order for this regime to work. In order for those defections to happen, they need to have a sense that defection is possible and there's a life post the regime, that they can be part of a security force that actually is working for the people rather than against the people. And that really needs proper strategy, a proper leadership, and a proper combined effort, organisation of the protesters, which, as Arash said, so far has been lacking, although I've noticed that in recent weeks, the figure of Reza Pahlavi has become far more popular and enjoying far more unified support than ever before. So it could be that we see him as being the spearhead of a new Iran, and I hope and pray that's the case, but I worry about the level of violence the regime still has up its sleeve.
Glenn, do you want to jump in there and defend your assertion as to why you think that these protesters maybe don't have enough autonomy of their own to want to stage a civil uprising of their own accord?
No, I'm sure many do stage protests on their own accord. Iran, like any other country, would have people are unhappy with the government and who would protest. I think there's many ways, though, you can try to instigate and manipulate the opposition. That is, first of all, Iran, one of the reasons why they have a lot of economic problems is because Iran's been under crippling sanctions for decades. And this is, of course, intended, which is very openly stated, to destabilize the economy, destabilize society, create a lot of unhappy, miserable people. And once there's riots or protests, then you have foreign intelligence agencies introducing some more violent elements into this mix, and also
why do we have sanctions
for this?
If I may ask you, why does Iran have sanctions?
And
why doesn't Algeria face sanctions? Why does Pakistan not face sanctions? What does all the, and I'm talking about countries that are, kind of anti-Western in their policy, actually. I'm not talking about countries that are West-friendly. Algeria is as anti-Israel as it comes, is a big critique of the United States and the West. It's a proud member of the Global South. How come Algeria doesn't face global sanctions? Iranians ask themselves, why is it that Iran needs to be next to Russia, the most sanctioned country in the world? Where do the sanctions come from? A job of a government is not to give speeches, about who is doing us harm. Is to be able to secure a good existence for its people. Iran is a country that was never colonized. It's one of the only few countries in the world that was never colonized. But every country faces superpowers. Even if we accept that U.S. has malign interest on us, all superpowers always have malign interest. Russia, surely, our next door superpower. But the question is, how can a government keep itself away from this? So Iranians ask themselves, why us? Why are we facing the sanctions? And the reason are the policies of the regime that have made it an enemy of pretty much every country in the world. It's a kind of an art. Australia and Canada, really nice little countries that are nice to everybody. Some of them even have ties with North Korea. Now they have cut diplomatic ties with Iran. Mm-hmm. So why is that? This is the nature of the regime that we are fighting for. So to say that the economic problems are due to the sanctions misses the point that why is it that Iran faces the sanctions in the first place?
Okay, Glenn, I'm going to let you quickly respond, and then I'm going to move us on to our next point.
Yeah, Iran is a key regional adversary. This is not a small country. It's a big power. This is seen by Israel as being their main enemy because not just because of their own strength, but also their own former relations with Syria, but also with Hezbollah, the Palestinians, the Houthis. So the idea that the British and Americans are trying to, their only mission with Iran is to have a free and democratic society, it's absurd. These are the same countries that backed the genocide in Gaza, the same people helped to install a former Al-Qaeda leader in Syria, massacring minorities. We've seen the same script from Libya as well. Everyone cares so much about the civilians. Everything is the fault of the government. You topple the government and make a mess out of it, and suddenly nobody cares that much anymore, and you move on to the next country. It's wild that we still buy into this premise that this is what the CIA and Mossad is worried about. That is,
I don't care what CIA and Mossad want. I don't care.
This is what we did.
I don't care what
This is what they do. We had already leaked the CIA documents from Afghanistan showing that when the Europeans lost interest in 20 years of occupation of Afghanistan, they decided, well, we have to sell it to the Europeans as being about women's rights because then you can get some more support. This is what you do in war. You sell the worst in humankind, but you sell it as the best. You make war sounds like they're virtuous. You want to destroy Iran? No, you want to suddenly help them spread democracy and human rights. This is not how a hegemon works. It attempts to knock out rivals. It doesn't try to promote women's rights in Iran. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Okay, Arash, I want you to respond to that. I mean, Glenn's bringing up this idea also, alluding to the possibility of a power vacuum, that there is this forced regime change and then what? The countries lose interest and they go elsewhere. If protesters want change at the top, what does that look like? Because the opposition is notoriously fractured. Is it going to be Pahlavi? We've seen images of the Shah now, where that hasn't cropped up in protests before. Is that enough of a unifying force? Or is there the possibility that if there is a change at the top, there's no unified movement to come up and fill that void behind them?
Look, first of all, he said, Iran, because Iran is a regional power they got on it. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. And yes, it doesn't faces the sanctions. And there are other big countries. Indonesia is a wonderful global power, but it doesn't face the sanctions. Yes, of course, it's because of Iran's support for Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Houthis that it faces sanctions. But why should our country support these terror groups that plague the lives of their own countries, have killed way more Arabs, by the way, that have ever killed Israelis or Jews? And that also threatened the destruction of Israel, which is a UN member state in the region. Why should we, how good does that do us? Would you like Norway to do that where you live? Would you like Norway to support this group? So instead of your GDP per capita being 50 and 60, and it can be a nice university professor and get paid, be like an Iranian university professor who has to now live on $200, $300. If you like these resistance groups so much, why don't you go and join them? And if the Iranian people, if my compatriots, the majority of them they wanted, let's say, you know what, we're going to sacrifice our lives because we want to support these terror groups in the region. Well, let us vote we will elect a government, and that government can decide whether it wants to back Hamas. That government can decide whether it wants to back Houthis. That government can decide whether it wants to follow this regional policy or not. After all, that's the point of a democracy. In Norway, you elect your government, so they decide what they want to do, whether they want to go join the Iraq war or not. I believe, whether they want to join Afghanistan or not. So that's what we are fighting for here. Now, look, yes, vacuum is a danger. Disintegration of Iran is a danger. Civil war is a danger, and that's why we should be, we should be careful about that. But it's not like number one, Khamenei is the reason we are here. Let's not forget, we don't have time. I'm a historian, but I'm sure we don't have much time for a history lesson here. In 2009, we elected a candidate from inside the regime, a former prime minister during the 1980s, who had helped many of these even militias that said, we elected him as a president for reform. Those elections were rigged. Iranians had to come out. Time and time again, Khamenei, this old man that has ruled over my country all my life since 1989, has effectively made any transition impossible by not allowing even the slightest critics of him to come to any power. So that's why, unfortunately, you think I like to be in a situation? Nobody likes the revolution, by the way. Nobody likes the revolution. I would have preferred a peaceful transition 10 times over. There's a reason we're here. But I have to say, yes, Mr. Pahlavi has many supporters in Iran. Not everybody, but he has many supporters in Iran. But there's also the rest of us. And what we have in common is our love for Iran. We take Iran seriously. We take Iran's territorial integrity seriously. This makes us quite different, I have to say, from Libya and Syria and other countries. Not that people there didn't take it seriously, but I believe there is more national cohesion, there's more tradition of a state within Iran. This doesn't mean that I'm not worried about the threat, but I think Iranians are alert to that threat, and we can come together, even with many figures. I want to say, you know who's going to run the Iranian oil ministry? 90% is going to be those who run the Iranian oil ministry today. Many of the things I said about Hamas and Hezbollah, where you can read them? You can read them in my book. I quote current diplomats of the Islamic Republic who say these things. Current diplomats. It was even Jawad Zarif, the former foreign minister of the Islamic Republic, who said, we can't be more Catholic than the Pope in regards to the support for the Palestinians. So these ideas are not some crazy ideas that are like really not shared by others. It's in fact a tiny minority led by Khamenei who have taken our country, they've borrowed our country effectively to run their little cause. Outside that, Iranians can come together. Yes, we have many divisions. Yes, we are divided on many issues, but we can definitely come together over a plan for a democratic transition that would safeguard Iran's territorial integrity and brings us back to a tradition of having balanced relations with the rest of the world. Whether it's Russia and China, the West, Israel, Arab countries, Iran wants to be a powerful, confident country that has friendly relations with all countries in the world.
Okay. The US has already intervened somewhat in this crisis, with President Trump announcing any country to do business with Iran will be hit with a 25% tariff on US trade. And in his latest social media post, he encouraged protesters to keep up the pressure, saying, and I quote, "Help is on the way." After what we saw in Venezuela, it's a very real threat. Jake, will the US intervene militarily, do you think? Could that be on the horizon?
Well, that's the main question that we're all agonizing over at the moment. Only one man in the world knows the answer to that, and that, of course, is Donald Trump. I recall in 2013 when Barack Obama famously laid down that red line to the Syrians, saying that if you use chemical weapons, we will take action, and then failed to enforce that red line when they did use chemical weapons. That greatly harmed America's reputation amongst its enemies and led to much unrest due to the emboldenment of those enemies. I can't imagine Donald Trump making these threats and not following them through. Of course, he's the president who, in his first term, authorized the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the notorious head of the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force for Iran. He's also recently fresh from the Venezuela operation as well. So and of course, he authorized the bombing of Iran's nuclear program just last June. So he's willing to use power in a way that previous American presidents have not been. It remains to be seen whether he will do it, but I live in hope that he will, targeting those perhaps 11 regional bases of the IRGC, targeting the Ayatollah's personal office, which is a sprawling network of repression, personality cult, aids in the enforcement, perhaps some other domestic targets as well, enabling the protesters not to be mowed down in the street and able to overwhelm and topple the regime. But I do worry about what may happen next, because you'll have 150,000 members of the Revolutionary Guards on the streets without leadership. The Ayatollah has decentralized command of the Revolutionary Guard since the 12-day war. Moderates or relative moderates, so sort of complacent, corrupt, older generations of the Revolutionary Guards have been purged in favor of younger zealots since the 12-day war. And so it's really, it's a much more formidable opposition even than it was a few months ago. Those people without leadership, with the crowd, the people in control, will be dangerous unless you can find another way, a way of encouraging defections, encouraging a new security force to take control. And then the problem of succession comes up, where Pahlavi is a much more unifying figure than he ever used to be. And as Arash mentioned, Iran is not Iraq. Iran has 3,000 years of coherent national history. Only half of Iranians are Persians, but the rest are, by and large, proud Iranians, much more cultural coherence than in Iraq before the American invasion, which was basically a new nation state. And so there's great hope that the Iranians will be able to come together and form a bright future. But there's also fears of the regime 2.0 retaining control under a different guise, under a different leadership. There is a danger of a nationalist strongman emerging and further repressing the people as well. I want a democratic transition, as does Arash and most other well-meaning people around the world. But it's a very, very vulnerable time for Iran at the moment, and we haven't even seen military action taken just yet.
Glenn, what's your read on the possibility of military intervention from the US? Can freedom really arrive on the back of a US bomb?
No freedom, but I do think now that these riots have failed, that Trump will consider striking Iran yet again. And I don't think much like in any of the other countries in that region, the outcome will not be any freedom or stability any more than it was in Iraq. So I think, likely we're heading towards another war.
What do you think, Arash? I mean, the US has been the author of a lot of pain in Iran, sanctions, strikes on nuclear facilities, just to name a couple recently. Do Iranians welcome or do they fear US intervention?
Look, first of all, yes, US has been, cause of definitely some pain, but, Iranians and Iranian revolutionaries, we make our diplomatic decisions based on, who our allies are, not based on like emotions, it's based on what we can use at any given time. So it's not like, even if the US has done some bad in the past, definitely has done some bad in the past of Iran, it doesn't mean that it can be our ally about our specific things. So, the question of foreign intervention, I haven't, are we all right?
Yes, continue on. We've just lost connection with Glenn, but we're going to re-establish it. So I'll stay with you and Jake for now, and we'll bring Glenn back in.
Maybe the Mossad interfered with his connection.
So I'm skeptical, frankly, on foreign intervention, just because at the best case scenario, I think it has unintended consequences. So I'm not sure what, and the president, look, it's true, President Trump, he's done a great deal of good in this world. I'm his political opponent. Look, I'm a lefty. I'm a socialist. I'm his political opponent. But he's done some good in the world. Bringing up the ceasefire in Gaza was one. Hey, he freed my friend Elizabeth Surkov, who was held by a Iraqi militia for more than 900 days. So I definitely believe his bold decision making sometimes can bring good things. But it really does depend on what kind of intervention is going to be and how is it going to help us. But at the end of the day, though, it's Iran that has brought itself to these conditions. I mean, a speaker of the parliament in a rally on Monday threatened Trump, said they're going to attack U.S. warships, said we're going to burn the region in fire, actually, literally, and this is a direct quote. So it's unfortunately they that have walked us into this conflict, United States, and with Israel, by the way. Why do we have to fight Israel? There's no reason, there's no national, do we have borders with Israel? But sure, Israel does very bad things to Palestinians, but how is that, again, why is Algeria not fighting Israel? Why is Pakistan not fighting Israel, right? It's not in our national interest to be in conflict with them. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the conflict with the US and Israel is what this regime has picked. It's out of our hands. But the job of democratic transition in Iran ultimately belongs to us. No matter whose planes are flying over whose skies, it's the Iranian political figures, Iranian civil society leaders that need together to work on a transition, and we will face different countries in the world, assess our interest based on how they serve us. By the way, when Ayatollah Khomeini was leading the revolution against Shah in 1979, you know what he did? He sent messages to Americans. He made sure he made channels open to the Americans. He presented himself to Americans as a sort of an anti-communist in order to make sure that they won't be so much against him. Every revolution needs a diplomatic approach to the world, and we will have ours. Not just to the US, but as I said, to Russia, China, Turkey, and others. It's in fact our job to tell the world that we don't want to turn Iran into another sort of now extremist country of the other side, but we want to be politics of good neighborliness, good relations with the rest of the world, and there's no reason for us not to get help from the US and other countries in the region when we can.
We're still having trouble re-establishing a connection with Professor Glenn Deason. So I'm just going to ask another question to you, Jake, and we'll see how we progress. We saw Oman's foreign minister visit Tehran on the weekend, and the widely held belief is that ahead of his visit, he would have spoken to the US about options for negotiations. He was, of course, a mediator during this crisis with the US early on. Could US intervention look more like a new Trump deal as opposed to a bombing campaign? Or do you think that page has turned and there's now no more room for negotiation?
I think that moment has passed, frankly. I mean, we've seen the regime desperately trying to play for time by requesting talks with Donald Trump. He initially seemed to entertain the idea, but then earlier today he tweeted that he wasn't going to take any meetings with the Iranians and instead said to protesters, keep going, help is arriving soon. I think Donald Trump hasn't been fooled by the Iranians. Their strategy, particularly with the nuclear negotiations, has long been to string out talks, to add talk after talk, negotiation after negotiation, to delay the process and put off the West, all the while pursuing its nuclear ambitions under the surface. President Biden fell for that hook, line and sinker. President Trump did not. They tried it on with him, and eventually he gave them 60 days. On the 61st day, military action was conducted on their nuclear sites. So I think that he won't fall for that again. And I don't think that there is a negotiated solution, a diplomatic solution here to accommodate the regime, because the regime, I think people often don't realize just what it has at its core. It is a fanatically millenarian, apocalyptic cult which wishes to bring global apocalypse, starting with eliminating the Jews, so that a figure called the Mahdi, a 12th Imam, will emerge from invisibility and gather 313 loyal fighters to wage war on the world, dominate it, turn it into an Islamic theocracy with broken up into 313 dominions, each ruled by one of his key fighters. That's what it wants. It wants an apocalypse. All of its strategy for years, for decades, the ballistic missile strategy, the nuclear strategy, the proxy militia strategy, has been organized around trying to evoke this apocalyptic vision. It doesn't even recognize its own borders. It recognizes a world divided into the Islamic faithful and then the unbelievers. And so that explains why it meddles across the region and even in the West. I mean, a friend of mine who was telling me yesterday was stabbed 4 times by the regime in London because he's an Iranian dissident journalist. He eventually couldn't be kept safe in Britain. He had to flee and fled to Israel to keep him safe. We've had numerous assassination and kidnap plots in Britain on our shores, across Europe and in the United States. The Iranian regime is a global menace, not just a regional menace. You cannot come to an accommodation with these people. You have to defeat them. And I think that the only way, sadly, I'm no fan of military force in general, but sadly, sometimes that is the only way forward. And I hope that Donald Trump will have a plan to do that.
Arash, wrap us up there. Is there option for negotiation? Would the protesters welcome some kind of negotiation, or do you agree with Jake that that time has now passed?
The protesters obviously won't welcome negotiations. By and large, they'll feel that they've been betrayed. But I do believe there is possibilities for negotiations. But the question is negotiations over what? The time where Iran would offer something like, oh, we're gonna suspend enrichment or something small is over. They would have to. I think the kind of look. I said at the beginning of the show that I believe Islamic Republic is out, that it cannot survive. And I said, I was careful. I said it needs core policies and core structures. Like even the name might be able to stand for a while, but it would have to give up some of its basic core structures. And this is, so it is possible that a faction of the regime sidelines Khamenei effectively, pushes him aside, comes to an agreement, with the U.S., and that would buy them some time. No, this won't be welcomed by most protesters. But I do think it's a possibility if you look really. But I also do want to say something. This whole thing about Mahdism and millionairism and all that. Look, it's true about some. Some version of it is true about Khamenei. I wouldn't put it in those terms, but he's definitely an Islamist ideologue who would sacrifice any rational interest for this ideology. And I think you alluded to that as well earlier, Jake. This is not true for much of the leadership cast at the Islamic Republic. This is not true of Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, who was giving that biggest speech. By the way, some advisors, some keen sort of observers rightly said that actually Ghalibaf's very anti-American biggest speech was a bit of auditioning in many ways, putting himself as a possibility to lead. So the fact, to make the long story short, there are many figures in the regime who actually are pretty transactional, and they will sell Khamenei down the road in order to make some sort of a deal with Trump that would sort of, that would keep them in power. But that would include them, that would, on the side of the president, would probably likely they would have to give up on, their core anti-American, anti-Israel policies, and it won't be a sort of an easy deal.
Mm-hmm. We haven't been able to re-establish our connection with Glenn Deason, so we will leave our debate there. It's been so interesting. It will be interesting days to come, hopefully less destructive. But Arash Azizi, it's been a pleasure to have you on Counterpoint, lecturer at Yale University and author of What Iranians Want, Women, Life, Freedom. Jake Wallace-Simmons, thanks for being with us, a Daily Telegraph columnist, I beg your pardon, and presenter of the Brink podcast, and our guest who we lost a little bit earlier in our debate, Professor Glenn Deason, the professor at University of Southeastern Norway and host of his YouTube channel. We thank him for his contribution. And to you at home for tuning in, thanks for being with us on this episode. Keep up to date with our latest debates and interviews by subscribing to Al Arabiya English on YouTube, and of course follow us on X and TikTok. Thanks so much. We'll see you for the next episode.